So, another man has been shot point blank while being held down by ICE officers. Hi, my name is Fraya. If you don't know who I am, my name is Fraya. Now, let's talk history and possibly how and why we got here. Before we get started, I would like to thank my high school U.S. history teacher. I know I fell asleep in your class a lot, and I mostly cheated off my best friend Barb, but if you were a high school teacher at Oxnard High School who was also a JV football coach who taught U.S. history, um, hi, thank you. Also, my apartment's a mess, so we're going to do this while I clean my apartment. Okay, so during the Civil War, a lot of things were happening. So originally, the Civil War was basically a trade war between the South and the Union. The South made a lot of our goods because of slavery. They made a lot of money off of it, and because cotton and tobacco were the two biggest transports or exports from the United States, they felt that they had more of a claim of what was going on. They wanted to secede. There was more to it, but that was the main issue for the most part, from what I remember. Eventually, because Europe wanted to take over parts of the United States, um, more notably France. That's when Abraham Lincoln decided to make the Civil War about slavery because since France had already abolished slavery at the time, it prevented them from helping the Confederacy from winning the war, right? Not necessarily that Abraham Lincoln even gave a shit about black people or slaves. He just wanted to make sure that the Union would win. So the Union wins the Civil War. What happens? Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee sign a fun little treaty. The Confederacy becomes part of the Union again. Robert E. Lee and the Confederates get to go home. Nobody gets punished. And that's where we're at right now. Through all that, more history happens, and eventually the Daughters of the Confederacy become a group in the South, also the KKK and a bunch of white supremacy groups. Minutia, minutia, minutia. More importantly, nobody was punished after the Civil War, and that's the main point here. Jim Crow laws get enacted in the South, and also the North have huge segregation laws. If you watch movies like, or not movies, read books like It, or watch movies like Hairspray, you understand that segregation went on through the 60s, even further. So people in the Union weren't exactly fond of black people either. They just didn't enslave them. They just paid them shitty wages and segregated them. So the West wasn't exactly fond of Mexican people, even though the majority of the West was Mexico before it was manifest destinied by the United States, which isn't in a lot of history books, at least the ones that you learn in high school and elementary school, basically K through 12, whatever. Most important takeback is nobody was punished during the Confederacy. Anyway, civil rights happen, and white people aren't exactly too fond of it. People make way more money, are starting to create their own businesses. Also, more history happened before all of that. The Tulsa massacres, Black Wall Street, the Central Park thing where it used to be a huge black community before it was a giant park. History, history, history. Anyway, that leads us to the 1980s and Reaganomics. All of these white people decide, well, these black queer people who are dying of AIDS have way more money. We need to do something about it. So then trickle down economics happens because of reasons, but I'm assuming that the main reason was because people who weren't white were becoming far more successful. And as we've learned through history, anytime people who aren't white become successful, white people have to find a way to destroy it in some capacity. Ergo, Reaganomics. So anyway, that happens, and because of everything that had happened through the boomers era, all of these Gen Xers are living a pretty great life. They're going to college for a pretty low rate. They're able to pay for their tuition and apartment on a part time job and a part time wage. But then my generation comes into adulthood, and the 2008 recession happens, and more history upon that. Occupy, blah, 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 blah. But no one was punished during the Confederacy after the Civil War. Also, a bunch of lynchings are still happening against Black, brown, and queer people. So this has been happening throughout history and being blamed on crazy things like unaliving yourself and other things. And the perpetrators are never found or punished, ironically, because no one was punished after the Civil War. I also forgot to mention 9/11 happens, and that's when ICE gets established by the Bush administration because for some reason they decided that it was immigrants' fault, even though everyone who flew in all had business visas. The people who did the plane thing all had business visas to the United States. They were not undocumented immigrants. They were documented with business visas. So a fun pattern that I've seen to notice is that each time that a conservative party does some like fucked up shit, the Progressive Party, or at least the majority of the Democratic Party or Progressive Party at this point, decide to usurp that power and use it for their own personal gain. So, like Reaganomics, for example, or uh, segregation. Ugh, jeez. And at the moment, it's ICE right now. They're not trying to defund it because they want to usurp it because they've seen what it can do, and they want to use it for their own personal gain, which is why they're not trying to defund it. Also, that's just my little conspiracy theory. It's not an actual fact, but patterns, you know? All because nobody was punished after the Civil War. Which brings us to today, where they just approved a bigger spending bill for ICE, and we had Democrats vote for it. Which brings us to today, where a man was just shot absolute point blank after being held down by several ICE agents, where Renee Good was shot point blank from her vehicle by an ICE agent, and countless other Black, brown, queer, and trans people who have been brutalized by officers of the law, and why we have representatives and conservatives who are acting as though that they are not going to get punished, because history has shown that they have not. And unless we get leaders who are not going to try to usurp that same power and use it for their own personal gain, Democrats, I see you, we're not going to change anything. And this is why we need to abolish ICE, defund the police department, and make absolute major changes in the United States, because this is where history has gotten us. And we barely changed a fraction, maybe.